my channel, Little Ray Sunshine. My name is Rayel. If you're new here, welcome. I'm new to YouTube too, so I really appreciate you watching my video. As you can tell from the title, I'm going to be talking about my labor and delivery story. The reason I chose this as my first video is because a lot of people talk about their pregnancy. They share their pregnancy story, the good, the bad, and everything in between. And then they kind of go missing when they have their labor and delivery. And then they come back with a beautiful baby. And they share about their experience having their child home with them. But they don't really talk about their labor and delivery story and how it's beautiful and it's also very scary. It's a long process. It's not just you push and your baby comes out, or they cut your stomach open and your baby comes out. So I just wanted to share my story because when I was going through it and I was preparing for it, I did not prepare for what happened to me. And I was not one of those moms who was naive to the fact that something could go wrong. But I did not expect this part to go wrong. So I just didn't want anyone to feel like they were alone in this process. And I just wanted to share my story because there are so many different stories about having kids, and we all need to uplift and support each other. So I'm hoping by sharing my story, someone who is having a baby or who is going through this currently, or who has already had a kid and went through this, can just comment below and share your story and uplift someone, encourage someone who is going through this process. My labor. So the first is, I was considered medically obese. And I say medically because I do not like the BMI index. However, that's what doctors use to determine whether or not you're, healthy, fit, active, obese, whatever the case may be. So when I was weighed pre-pregnancy, I was considered medically obese, which means I had more or equal to 30% body fat according to the BMI index. Therefore, I wasn't a high-risk pregnancy, but they did have to monitor me more because things could occur when you're considered obese. So they just wanted to make sure that my baby was safe. So I did have to take an extra glucose test. I had to do some extra blood work. And then a month from my due date, of course, you go see your OB once a week. Any pregnant person goes to see their OB once a week once they're about a month out from their due date. But I also had to go to the hospital twice a week to get monitored. So they would monitor my kid's heart rate, they would monitor the movement, and then of those two appointments, one of them they would take a sonogram to look at the fluid, to look at the measurements, to make sure my child was growing properly. So I was at the doctor's 3 times a week at 8-9 months pregnant. That's a lot of driving, especially because from my house, my OB is 15 minutes away, which is not that bad. But my hospital was 45 minutes away. My husband works 2 hours away from our house, and he works 3 hours away from our hospital. So imagine. And another detail I want to tell you is that because my husband works so far away, we did not require him to go to every appointment with me, just because we wanted to save his leave and his annual time for when our kid actually was born and arrived, so he could spend time with our child rather than go to these appointments for 10-20 minutes and we don't get any pictures, we don't see anything. And the appointments pretty much were regular. It was, okay, you're good to go. Or, oh, okay, this is happening. It wasn't anything that I couldn't convey on the phone. So I was perfectly okay with him just going to the really special ones where we found out the sex, or we had a sonogram where they actually printed pictures. Those types of appointments. So I went to the doctor, I meant the OB, I think it was September 25th, a week out from my due date. So my due date was October 4th. I went to the OB September 25th just for a regular appointment to make sure everything was going well. And while I was at my appointment, they asked if I wanted to see how far dilated I was. And of course, I want to know how far dilated I am. I want to know if my kid is going to come right now or if I have some time. So I was ignorant to what a pelvic exam actually was. I've never had one before until I got pregnant. So this is how the baby is created, right? It goes so far. Your husband can only go so far. However, the doctor goes further. And I use this visual because that's what happened to me. It was the most uncomfortable experience I've had in my life. I was so naive to what they were checking for. So when it happened, I was so uncomfortable. But I ended up being 2 centimeters dilated, which is good. That means my labor was progressing. However, being dilated, especially at 2 centimeters, 3 centimeters, it's not really consistent. It doesn't mean that you're starting to go into labor. It could be 3 weeks or it could be 3 hours. Your child decides when they want to come. So I left that appointment and I was driving. And for the first time in my pregnancy ever, I didn't want to be pregnant anymore. And that's not something that I ever said in my pregnancy. So, and I actually have a video that I recorded while I was driving to my child, telling them to come on. I was ready because I did not feel well. After that pelvic exam, I did not feel well. I thought something was wrong. So I called my husband and I was like, I don't feel well. I feel awful, but nothing's happened down there. I just came from the doctor. I don't know what's up. So he told me to go home and relax. When he got home, if something else occurred, he would take me to the hospital. So I went home and I got into the tub. And I just ran myself a lukewarm bath because if you have a super hot bath, you start to have contractions when you're pregnant. And I didn't want to expedite my labor because I was perfectly content with it happening on its own. So I was in the tub and I laid there and I was just relaxing. And then I just felt a swoosh. And I wasn't sure if it was me moving or what, but I was nervous because I'm like, did my water just break? So I'm looking it up on my phone. And it doesn't seem like my water is broke. So I told my husband when he got home, he said, okay, let's watch it. So we watched it. And that night, I had asked him, I was like, you know, I usually don't ask you to go to these appointments. Can you come to this one at the hospital with me just in case something is wrong? I know you have a major meeting tomorrow, but do you think that you'd be able to come? It's a little bit later in the day. Maybe you can get off early enough. So he's like, let me see my schedule. So he looks and he's like, babe, I don't know if I can do this. Like, my meeting is at this time and your appointment is at this time. I don't know if I'm gonna make it on time. And this is a really, really important meeting. And he's right. Usually if it's not so important, he'll tell me. But this one was one of the most important meetings he had thus far. So I was like, okay, no problem. I'll call you with the updates. Just try to get home as soon as possible because I'm not really feeling well. He's like, okay, no problem. So I call my friend who's been going to some of my appointments with me. And that was one good thing that I had. I had church family, friends that would go to my appointments with me because my family does not live where we live. So I was able to have that extended support. And they were super excited to be a part of the process. So I wasn't going to tell them they couldn't go. So my friend ended up going with me. And I'm really glad that she did because I still was not feeling well. Like I felt so, it wasn't like, I felt nauseous and dizzy, but not to the extent of like morning sickness. It was something different. So I actually asked her to drive, which is not normal for me. All my friends know I get motion sickness and I also don't really like trusting people to drive. So I always drive everywhere or we meet somewhere. But because I did not feel well and I did not feel stable enough to drive, I told her to go ahead and drive. And sometimes I'm a little nervous when she drives because she like texts and drive or she gets distracted. But this day, my girl came through. She drove amazingly. And she drove the speed limit. Like, I was so impressed. So I even said something. I was like, girl, you're driving really good right now. So we made it to my appointment. And of course, they hooked me up to the heart rate monitor. They check my baby's movement. And then they're like, okay, let's go take a sonogram. Let's check things out. I'm like, okay, cool. So we're talking, and then the nurse interrupts and she's like, I need to call upstairs where the labor and delivery nurses are. And they're like, I need to call upstairs. Something's not looking right on your sonogram. And I'm like, okay. She's like, your fluid is low. I didn't know what that meant. I just thought, hey, okay, cool, no problem. So she calls up there and they're like, send her up. So they send me upstairs, and the nurse before I left was like, you might go into labor today. They might induce you. However, because you have a due date of next week, they might not. They might just send you home. So I don't know what's going on. Just go upstairs. They'll tell you. So I get upstairs. They're like, do you have your suitcase with you? And I'm like, yeah, it's in my trunk. They're like, go grab it. Have you ate? And I'm like, no, I haven't ate because I was waiting till after my appointment. They're like, go eat because we don't feed you here. You're going to have your baby. We're going to go ahead and induce you. There's no reason to wait and put your baby at risk because your fluid is lower than normal. And I'm like, what the? So I'm like, I'm excited, but I'm also super nervous because my husband is in his meeting at this time. I do not want to have this baby without him. So my friend and I, we go to the grocery store. I try to call my husband at his desk because he cannot take his phone into his job. So I try to call him at his desk. He did not answer. So I email his boss from his email and say, hi, this is Brent's wife. I'm going into labor. Is there any way you can contact him? They didn't even look at their email because duh, they're in that meeting too. So I'm freaking out because I can't get a hold of my husband. So I do ask the nurse before I leave. I'm like, do you think I'm going to have this baby within the next couple of hours? And she's like, it's very unlikely. It depends on how fast your labor and how fast this inducement works. However, it's highly unlikely. So I'm like, okay. My friend who came with me is super excited because prior to us getting to the hospital, she's like, what if you have the baby right now? I'm going to be so pressed that I'm here. And I'm like, whatever, shut up. But she was right. She wanted to be there and she was. And I was okay with it, but I just couldn't. I hate when people tell me that they're right. I don't like it. So she takes me to the grocery store and we get a bunch of snacks. So we get fruit, we get stuff that I can eat, that I can munch on throughout the night that won't go bad. And so I call my husband's father and I'm like, hey, I'm about to have the baby. And he's like, okay, I'm getting off work. I had also asked my husband's aunt, who I'm really close with, to come to the hospital with me because my mother couldn't be there at the time. She had taken off on my original due date and they live in a different state. So she came that weekend. I got induced on a Thursday. My child was born on a Friday. My mom came that Friday night. So I had asked my aunt to come and just be there with me. I wanted someone's support. And so I called her and she's like, okay, I'm going to cancel the rest of my clients. I'll be there soon. So then I call my parents and I'm like, I'm about to be induced. This is what's happening. And so I actually called my mom because she can have her phone at work. And she called me back. And then she called my dad, who called me. And they're just talking to me. And one's calling me because, you know, they're not in the same room. One's calling me, the other's calling me. I'm like, I'm super excited that they're calling and they're excited. But at the same time, it's like I'm overwhelmed because I still can't get in contact with my husband. So my dad, because he works in a similar field as my husband, he's like, well, what building number is he in? Maybe I can call. And I'm like, I have no idea. We didn't talk about this. I didn't even know there was building numbers, to be completely honest. And so he's like, oh, okay, well, I mean, you could send out like a little Red Cross alert, but it might take some time. But I think you'll be okay. I don't think it's that extreme. I'm like, okay, cool. So my friend, her boyfriend is a cop. So he's like, hey, I can contact the cops down there and see if anyone can get in contact with him. And I'm like, you can see what happens, but I highly doubt that I have enough information for you to find him. And he's like, okay, well, I'll see what I can do. In the meantime, you know, congratulations. And I'm like, cool, thanks. So we leave the grocery store and we leave and my friend puts in the address in, but she puts in the wrong address. So we end up going to the wrong hospital. And I tell her that. And she's like, I'm like, I have to be there like now. and we're across town. And she's like, don't worry, girl, I got this. This is when she starts driving reckless. And I'm like, girl, it's okay. But she got me there. She got me there safe. I'm really appreciative of her being there, and we made it safe. So we get to the hospital and we go and we check in, and they tell me to get unchanged and they tell me the process. So what happens is they put in a little balloon up there, and the balloon was supposed to expand over time slowly to help me dilate. They also hooked me up to some IVs, and they gave me some medicine to also help the contractions kind of expedite. So that's what I'm dealing with right now. Now, I'm that type of pregnant woman who always peed every 5 minutes. It did not matter what I did. I peed every 5 minutes. So the nurses were kind of getting irritated because I was hooked up and I had everything in me, but I had to pee every 5 minutes. And I was trying to hold it. Like, I was like, because I hate getting up and using the bathroom. So I was peeing every 5 minutes. So I got to the point where they're like, can you not drink anything right now? And because we need to get a proper like monitoring, and then we can like work from there. So I'm like, okay, fine. So the next time I go to the bathroom is about an hour or so after, and the balloon thing flops in the toilet. So I'm like, can you go get the nurse? And she's like, oh, that's good. That means you're dilating really quickly, quicker than we expected. That's good. We're gonna see if we can break your waters and if we can get another pelvic exam to see how dilated you are. Now, bear in mind, I went into this labor process saying that I was not going to get an epidural or any medication until or if I felt like excruciating pain and I started to cry, because I didn't want to put myself unnecessarily through pain, but I also didn't want to medicate myself unnecessarily. So they're going up there. Again, remember the first pelvic exam I told you about? This is the second one, but I have contractions that I barely feel, and they're trying to break my water at the same time. It was the most uncomfortable experience, even more uncomfortable than the first pelvic exam. So they're trying to break my waters to tell me to relax. I'm like, I am relaxing, but I'm like super tense, because when something goes up a place that something's not supposed to go up, it's uncomfortable. So they can't break my waters, and they're like, that's not a problem. Maybe it will naturally break by itself. We're going to go ahead and hook your baby up to the monitor again, because the fluid is low. We want to make sure the heart rate's okay, because if not, we'll have to take you into an emergency C-section. So I finally get a hold of my husband. He's on his way. He's super nervous because he's like, am I going to miss it? Am I going to miss it? I'm like, you're not going to miss it. I'm still only like 3-4 centimeters dilated. I have to make it to 9 or 10. He's like, okay, I'll be there soon. Do you want anything? Do you need anything? I'm like, no, it's okay. So my friend is still there. We're talking. And then my aunt came. So we're talking. And then my husband's father came. But he did not stay because he wasn't feeling well. And he didn't want to get more sick himself, because hospitals tend to make you more sick if you're not, you know, medicated properly at that point. And then also he didn't want to get me sick. So he went home, and then we have our dog at home, so someone needed to go home and walk her and feed her and everything like that. So he was holding down the fort. I'm on the phone on and off with my parents, giving them updates, and we're just kind of conversing. Time is going by pretty quickly. My husband arrives, and then my friend actually ends up leaving. So we're just conversing and just passing the time, talking, munching on snacks, just making sure that I'm as comfortable as possible. In between, the nurses are checking on me. The doctors are just telling me updates on things that are going on. So I was checked in around 1 o'clock. I was induced around like 3:30. And then my husband got there around like 4 or 5. And then by the time it was about, I want to say like 9 or 10 o'clock, they came and checked me, said I was like 6-7 meters dilated. So but at that point in time, I was feeling them contractions. It wasn't, so I have a high tolerance of pain. So they were asking me if I felt contractions, and I was like, not really. And then when I started to feel them, it was just pressure. It wasn't anything sharp, so I was able to tolerate it. However, probably around like 11, or probably around no later than midnight, I was feeling it. I was like you see in pregnant like, you know, in movies when people are pregnant, but I was a lot more calm than they were. I was so calm through this process because it was all a blur. It went so quickly, even though it was a long period of time. So at that point in time, I asked for epidural because it was just unbearable. One little G tear fell from my face. So I told them to go ahead and give me an epidural because I didn't want to be in pain the rest of the night. And I didn't want it to be too late for me to get an epidural and I'm in too much pain. So at that point, I'm asking for an epidural. And then all of a sudden, I start throwing up. As I'm throwing up, my water breaks. Do you know how weird that is? That's a weird experience. So my water breaks and I'm throwing up. And I had just had Jello. So I'm throwing up Jello and Gatorade at this point. So the nurses are like, oh, great. Your labor is moving along quickly. We wanted the water to break. That's exactly what we're going to do. We have to go ahead and get this baby out as soon as possible because there's only a certain period of time once your water breaks that you can have this baby out safely. But you're progressing. You're like 8, 9. You're like, I think I was like 7 or 8 centimeters dilated at that point. So like you're doing really well. So the guy comes in who does my epidural, and honestly, like I thought it was gonna hurt more, but it didn't. I mean, it did hurt, but not really. Like it just felt like a really sharp like wasp sting, and then it was done. So once that epidural kicked in, woo child, I was feeling good. And I was blessed enough to where I didn't feel pain, but I was able to move my legs, which was really good for pushing because I was able to push. So I probably took like a 30-minute nap after my epidural because I was tired. And then they woke me up. They checked to see how far dilated I was, and I was 9 centimeters. So that's really good. At 9, they tell you to go ahead and practice pushing and that your baby will be here soon. So the nurse asked my husband and my aunt to hold both of my legs, and we practiced pushing. She taught me how to push. She was like, you just push forward, take a deep breath, and you push every time I tell you. If you can do it every time I tell you, then we can do this quickly. So I'm like, okay, cool. She's like, all right, we gotta wait for a contraction. So the contraction started. I'm pushing like she said, and they say they start to see my baby's head. So they're like, whoa, you're a really good pusher. So they go and get the doctors, and the doctors are like, okay, we're gonna go ahead and have this baby. So the doctors are like, keep pushing, you're doing well. We're gonna go ahead and get this baby out. You're gonna meet her very soon. And I'm like so excited, but I'm also like, okay, Rael, let's get this done. I don't want to be doing this for 5 hours like some people. Let's get this done. So I'm pushing and I'm doing a really good job. My baby is crowning at this point. However, she had a big head, and so she kind of got stuck. So they were like, we might have to use the suction cup tool to get her out, but we don't have to if you can do it and you can keep pushing. So I'm like, no problem. Like, I can't breathe. You're having me push like every 2 minutes for a minute. I can't breathe. We gonna keep doing this. So I push. My husband is like, I can see her. I can see her. Push, push, push. And I'm so excited. So I'm pushing. And then they lay her on me, and we do skin to skin, and it was the most amazing feeling ever. It was the best moment of my life. So I'm doing skin to skin. My husband is looking. He's like so proud. The doctors are swarming because they got to make sure everything's good. And then they tell me I got to push again because we got to get the placenta out. That was so much easier. We just pushed, boop, came out. And then they check to make sure they got all the placenta out, because if you have any left, it can cause health issues. It can actually kill you if there's any left. So they made sure everything was out. And the nurses take my baby girl and they clean her up and they weigh her and they measure her. While they're doing that, you know, they're cleaning up me, they're stitching up me. They said that I Didn't really tear as much as, like, I had a second degree tear, which isn't that bad. It was like a little, probably this size tear, and that I would heal just fine as long as I took care of myself. So I'm like, okay, cool. And then the doctors are really supportive. They ask if we want a family picture, and they take pictures for us, and then they clear out the space, and all that's left is my nurse and the pediatrician and then my actual OB. So, and the funny thing is, the OB that gave me my first pelvic exam where I didn't feel well is the one who actually delivered me, and she was my favorite one, so I'm glad that she was our doctor. So the nurse is like, hooks my child up to a breathing machine, but she's not breathing the way she's supposed to. So she tells the pediatrician, hey, she's not breathing as well as she's supposed to. The pediatrician is like, no worries. Sometimes it takes them a little bit to get used to breathing, because the way they breathe in the womb is different than the way they breathe out in the world. So they monitor her for a little bit. She doesn't get any better. So they call NICU, which is the neonatal intensive care unit, to come and just check on her and bring her to that unit to make sure that she's okay. So they come, they're asking questions, and then they're like, okay, go ahead and say goodbye to your kid. We're gonna take her. We're just gonna monitor for a couple hours. She should be back in your room in no time. And I'm like, okay, cool. So we're holding her, we're saying goodbye, and then they take her. So my husband follows. They give him some information just saying that they're gonna take her and monitor for a couple hours. They show him where she's gonna be. Then he comes back to the room. So I'm asking these questions. That's what he relates to me. So he's like, don't worry about it. Let's worry about you. Let's go ahead and get some breakfast and move you to the other room. We have a baby girl. This is so exciting. Da da da. So we're calling our parents, obviously, because they're not there. My aunt ends up going home because she's tired. She congratulates us, and then she goes home. And then, you know, my parents are like, okay, we're on our way. We'll be there probably late tonight, yada, yada, yada. And they also said, you know, keep us updated on what's going on. So I'm like, okay, no problem. So we order breakfast, and then we eat. And then the nurses come in, and they're like, hey, do you think you can walk? This is the funniest part of my pregnancy, because I'm like, yeah, I can move my legs, no problem. I want to go see my kid. I got up to walk, and I almost fell. Because when you have an epidural, it has to get all the way out of your system before you can walk. So they were trying to get me to go to the bathroom. I couldn't make it to the bathroom. And so I had to pee in the pot, which is even harder because I had to lift all my weight on my arms and pee at the same time and wipe. And I just had a baby. So while we're waiting for them to get a wheelchair, for somebody to wheel me to go see my kid, they say to go ahead and pump. So they teach me how to pump, and they're like, don't worry if no milk comes out at that point in time. We just are getting you in the habit of pumping. So I pumped for like 15 minutes, as they said. Nothing came out, and it was just like someone pinching my nipples the whole entire time, but nothing came out. So they were able to get a wheelchair for me, and they wheel me to where my baby girl is. This was the hardest part for me, because when I got there, she was hooked up to everything that I was hooked up to at the time. She was in an incubator. They had her on a breathing machine. She had an IV in her belly button, so she never got to actually like have an umbilical cord, because they had to put her IV into her belly button. And she just looked so puffy and so, like, I don't know, because they were pumping fluids into her to make sure she was okay and air into her. And they basically told me that something went wrong, whether it was an infection or she had pneumonia. They couldn't quite figure it out, but she was fighting, and by that it was straining her lungs and her heart. And so it was making it hard for her to breathe. And they had her on an oxygen machine, and most people breathe at 70% air, but she was breathing at 150. They only regularly do 100. And I couldn't hold her, I couldn't feed her, and they were doing x-rays on her. And at one point in time, they had to put the IV in her arm, in her veins, and put it all the way up, connected to her heart. So at that point in time, I felt helpless because I'm your mom and it might have been my fault why you're sick. And then I was mad at the doctors because I watched a whole bunch of labor videos prior to, and they said that when your baby is pushed out, they're supposed to put a finger in their mouth so they don't breathe in all the fluids. And I don't think that happened, but it could have, and I just didn't see it. Either way, it was no one's fault. This is a regular thing that happens. And they did an awesome job of making sure that my child was okay and that we were updated. So they ended up putting her on antibiotics. She was monitored really closely. She was on that oxygen for about a couple of days. She was in NICU for a total of 2 weeks. And it was almost going to be 3 weeks, but she was a fighter. My daughter was a fighter. She ended up healing very quickly. And so we were able to take her home 2 weeks later. And I am going to do a separate video on my whole NICU experience and what exactly happened while we were there. So if you have a similar labor and delivery story, feel free to comment below. If you have any questions about my labor and delivery story, comment below. I really appreciate you guys watching. Please subscribe, like this video, and tell me any other topics that you want about motherhood, marriage, any vlogs you want to see. Thanks so much for watching. Say hi, Ray Ray. Say hi, stay here. Say bye-bye.